At the end of the 19th century, there was a folkloric belief in Britain that the Isle of Man, a Crown Dependency in the Irish Sea, was once inhabited by fairies, known then as little people, who lived in the forests and mountains. In fact, it remains a common superstition that the fairies of this land are still very much there, though choosing to avoid the hubbub of the city, relegated themselves into nature. According to 19th century folklorist Arthur William Moore in his work Folklore of the Isle of Man, these fairies could be kind and helpful, or they could be wicked and malevolent. He describes them as being very much like human beings in form and feature, though much smaller and delicately constructed. At a distance they were believed to be handsome, but upon closer inspection they could be found to be withered and decrepit. Unlike angels and demons found in biblical apocrypha, fairies of this nature were believed by Moore to have been part spiritual and part physical, allowing them to possess magical abilities, but also enabling them to manipulate the very corporeal world in which we shared. Now, some of these fairies were benevolent. Moore describes them as curing diseases, bringing good fortune, and playing music so wonderfully that it could be nothing short of divine. Yet he also warns us that these very fairies could be malevolent too, stealing children, abducting men and women, bringing bad luck, and even using that same enchanting music to entrap the unsuspecting listener. Given this notion that there were good and bad fairies, one might be tempted to ask if this was simply dependent on their individual nature, or if they too were like humanity, consisting of those who walked a righteous path under the watchful eye of God, or if they walked a more self-serving and unabashful path that went completely the other way. Well, if you asked early church father Origen of Alexandria, going by his work Contra Celsum, pretty much anything spiritual that wasn't an angel was basically categorized as demonic. Now, it's important to note that Origen never actually spoke about fairies in particular, but he did write extensively about spiritual beings that might have found themselves in these realms. Simply put, according to Origen, the pagan gods did exist. Spiritual beings were not the figments of one's imagination, and any spirits that frequented springs, the forests, or the winds were very much real. Indeed, this might not sound very Christian for an early church father, but he does go on to elaborate that whilst they were real, they were not what respective communities who worshipped or recognized these beings believed them to be, but were in fact misidentified demons. Therefore, whether a Canaanite deity or a Hindu god, a water nymph, a gnome, or an elf, anything that wasn't an angel and presented itself with some kind of magical ability was basically categorized as a demon and stigmatized as wicked. You can then rest assured that if Origen of Alexandria did encounter the likes of a fairy, he would likely have recognized it as a demonic spirit. Indeed, these pagan entities, though real enough to be perceived, were not who they said they were, and therefore lacked any moral goodness, and thus ought not to have been trusted. Meanwhile, according to 16th century Swiss physician Paracelsus, in his work on nymphs, sylphs, pygmies and salamanders and other spirits, it was argued that fairies, while spiritual, belonged to nature and were not demons. In this work, they were classified into 4 different species: gnomes, which were earth spirits, nymphs, which were water spirits, sylphs, which were air spirits, and salamanders, which were fire spirits. Unlike Origen of Alexandria, Paracelsus argued that fairies, or such spirits, were not demons in disguise, and perhaps more crucially, they were a part of God's natural creation, just like animals. With these two contradictory notions, it's not really possible to determine why good fairies were good or why bad fairies were bad. It's also made all the more unclear by the fact that fairy morality varies drastically depending on the folklore and culture. One way we see this is in the concept of the fairy queen, who, again going by various legends, differs from story to story, who, unlike her subjects, can be viewed as kind and graceful or wicked and malicious. In Irish mythology, for example, the character Una, or Nula, was known as the fairy queen, alongside the more famously fairy king Finvarr. In one legend, Finvarr is cursed by a human woman and made thereafter to serve as her midwife. Hearing of this, Una, although unnamed in this legend, though believed to still be the fairy queen, seeks vengeance upon the woman and constructs a maniacal accessory in the form of a belt as a gift to her. The belt is quite sadistic, for it was believed that once worn, it would split the woman in half. Such intentions show us the capacity for wickedness amongst the fairy kind, for even though Una was slighted in that her husband was made a servant, she was then willing to kill the offender in a rather gorily fashion. Luckily though, the woman was spared of the belt because she was warned about its diabolical properties by yet another fairy, who was obviously looking out for her. This then delineates the dichotomy between good and evil fairies. There were those who could have such dark intentions towards humans, and there were those who sought to save humans, even from their own kind. In early 8th century legend, Cleena, yet another fairy queen, sometimes believed to be the queen of the banshees, is shown to possess rather malicious and hostile characteristics. We learn that Cleena fell in love with an accomplished human prince named Kiev, and desired to be married to him. The only issue was that Cleena also had a sister named Ivel, who secretly fell in love with Kiev too, and used her own arts to secretly gain his affections. Upon finding out about this, Cleena cursed her sister in a fit of jealousy, which resulted in Ivel becoming stricken with old age and grave sickness. Under the guise of nursing her back to health, Cleena, believing that Kiev might still find Ivel attractive, even in her withered state, concocted a sleeping agent so powerful that it was believed Ivel was dead. Ivel was entombed in a cave, though was believed to have regained consciousness. Upon learning of this, Cleena promised to relieve Ivel of her imprisonment the moment she forgot about Kiev, and effectively no longer wanted him. But when she realized that this was never going to happen, and that her sister would always love him, she grew even more vengeful and jealous, and turned her into a white cat. Whilst Cleena got to marry Kiev, she did eventually prove to be remorseful, and confessed the truth to Kiev that her sister was now buried in a cave but was still alive, albeit in the guise of a cat. When requested to lift the spell, Cleena claimed she no longer remembered the spell, or had lost her magical wand, effectively damning her sister to such a fate. In another tale concerning Cleena, the fairy queen becomes besotted with a chieftain named Fitzgerald, a man who was renowned for his playing of the harp, and who could play the instrument so beautifully that he was even able to swoon a woman named Ellen O'Brien into marrying him. One day, Cleena heard Fitzgerald playing his harp and became infatuated with him. Without any thought to his wife, she ferried him off to her place of residence in the fairy world, and kept him there with her for many months, with no intention of ever giving him back. When Ellen consulted with a wizard, she learned the truth behind her husband's disappearance and appealed to Cleena to return Fitzgerald. Apparently, Ellen's words were so profound that Cleena felt remorseful and surrendered Fitzgerald back to his wife. Yet Cleena was not always so accommodating and compunctious. In a legend in the 18th century, a wedding between one John Fitzjames and an Isabel Butler was met with tragedy when John was seemingly struck dead in front of his new bride. Whilst confusion and panic spread through the wedding reception, it was generally agreed that John's dramatic and unusual death had to have been him being transported to the fairy land, his spirit having been kidnapped there and then by none other than Cleena. In this legend, friends and family also appeased Cleena in the same way Ellen O'Brien had done, but this time their words fell on deaf ears because the fairy queen refused to return John Fitzjames and deemed to keep him for herself. Once more, we get two sides of fairy morality from these legends. One of a queen who is a bit of a man-eater, who stops at nothing to achieve her desires and even kidnaps her victims against their will, but also a queen who can be remorseful and moved to empathy. Fairies then, you might say, abide by the same moral codes that human beings do. Some humans are good, some humans are bad. The morality of each individual fairy, though, also resembles the complexities surrounding our own virtues and principles, where we are capable of expressing empathy and atoning for our mistakes, but also capable of doing horrible things and experiencing little to no contrition. Clena's tragic sister Ivel also appears as an antagonistic fairy queen in the 18th century comedic poem The Midnight Court by Brian Merriman, though she appears with the name Eva. In this narrative, a young woman approaches Eva in the fairy court and laments that despite her attempts to find a husband, the men in Ireland are only interested in skirt chasing, or when they do decide to settle down, favour older women instead. An older man, believed to be the poet, also chimes in against this young woman, berating her and other young women for being promiscuous. In fact, he is so against marrying young women, and further against marriage altogether, that he begs the fairy queen to do away with it altogether. In response, the young woman calls for the opposite, and even the abolition of priestly celibacy, because this is another set of eligible men whom she can't marry. After hearing both sides, Ivel decides to side with the young woman, and deems that all men at the age of 21 must marry, or they are to be killed by the hands of the Irish women. Those who are bachelors, womanizers, or just happen to be gay, are to be rounded up and murdered by the women. The only unmarried men who are exempt from this rule are the priests, because according to Ivel, she had no power to abolish the priestly celibacy, as this was effectively out of her jurisdiction. Whilst we don't see this fairy queen physically impose herself upon humanity as the previous queens we've discussed have done, we do still see her capacity for evil, in that she is able to manipulate and adjust the laws of man so as to incite violence, particularly against men in this example. In this narrative, a matriarchal power is established almost overnight, and even the poet himself is later found to be surrounded by a group of belligerent women who intend to flog him for his marriageless ways. It's interesting though that despite this ability to override the law of man, Ivel is unable to override the law of the Christian God, for she is by no means seen to be capable of abolishing the celibacy of the priests. There is no reason given to us as to why this is, other than it being something that only the Vatican had the power to do, but it does give the impression that if the fairy queen is unable to overcome this obstacle, perhaps she is therefore unable to work against this Christian deity and change the rules that he had put in place. The most ironic thing about this poem is that at the point where this new matriarchal society is born, and man finally suffers under the heel of woman, the poet wakes up in his bed and realizes the whole thing was just a terrible dream. In medieval Arthurian tradition, Morgan Le Fay is often portrayed not merely as a sorceress, but as a fairy or otherworldly being, a liminal figure inhabiting the human world and the realm of the fairy. As Arthur's half-sister, her interactions with mankind are both intimate and fraught, and yet have a deeply ambiguous nature about them. Indeed, she can be viewed as both a protector and an undoer of Arthur, and it is precisely this duality that creates some of the central tensions within the greater Arthurian narrative. As a protector, Morgan is repeatedly associated with the healing and preservation of Arthur. In La Morte d'Arthur, for example, she is one of the queens of Avalon who carries the mortally wounded Arthur away from the Battle of Camlan, promising that he may yet be healed by her arts. Avalon itself is a fairy realm of restoration, and Morgan's knowledge of herbs, enchantments, and time-defying magic places her in the role of guardian of the king's body and legacy. Yet in many romances encasing the legend of Arthur, we also see Morgan succumb to more dastardly measures, where she is seen to test and even attempt to overthrow Arthur entirely. She steals Excalibur and gives it to her lover Accolon to fight Arthur. She reveals the affair between Guinevere and Lancelot. She even seduces Arthur, her half-brother, leading to the conception of Mordred, who ultimately ends up killing Arthur. In such romances, Morgan Le Fay as a fairy becomes a resounding mark upon Arthur's reign, perhaps even a dark counterpart to Merlin, with one seeking to maintain peace and order, whilst the other intending to insert chaos and disorder. Yet the duality of Morgan's behaviour, her good and bad traits, are effectively quite typical of fairy legends, where they are seen to exhibit tendencies that are both righteous and yet wicked. Such a paradoxical character certainly makes them hard to categorise, let alone trust. And perhaps this is the nature of folklore in general, where various characters are rewarded or imposed with certain characteristics that may or may not honour them. In this, you might see why the likes of Oregon of Alexandria were quick to label the likes of fairies as demonic and be done with, because combing through the complex nature of such creatures across various different legends, where they could be either good or bad, was simply too time-consuming. In a sense, Oregon of Alexandria might have felt that he was doing everyone a favour, for it was better to ward against a creature like a fairy, who though was known to some as a benefactor and an agent of healing, than it was to trust one who was known to others as violent, jealous, and capable of abduction. In a traditional folk ballad known as Alison Gross from Scotland, Alison Gross, appropriately named, was a hideous witch who desired a lover. After meeting the narrator, she attempts to groom him and incite him with gifts. But when all of her advances fail, she grows vengeful and transforms him into a dragon before binding him to a tree. As the legend goes, the Sealy Court, believed to be a court of fairies composed of friendly fairies in Scotland, stumbles across the dragon and wishes to set him free. Realising that this is in fact a man who's been cursed into this form, the fairy queen of the Sealy Court seeks to absolve him of this suffering, and thus strokes him 3 times, which results in him being restored to his original form. Perhaps a more well-known Scottish legend that showcases the more dastardly traits of fairies comes in the form of the legendary ballad of Tam Lin. In this legend, it is said that Tam Lin was something of a spectre, or an elf, that stole the virginity of any woman venturing into the forest of Carterhaugh. A young woman named Janet happens to pass through one day, and when she emerges from the other end, later finds herself to be pregnant. Returning to the forest to confront Tam Lin, the spectre explains to her that he was once a mortal man, but that the queen of the fairies kidnapped him one day when he fell from his horse, and thereafter imprisoned him in her service and forced him to commit these dreaded acts. What's more, the fairy queen in this example is further associated with the demonic, or the dark arts, as Tam Lim explains that she sacrifices one of her own kind to hell, or to the devil, at midnight on Halloween. Janet does later help Tam Lim escape from the fairy queen's clutches, and though the queen is shown to be resentful, she does allow Tam Lim his freedom. Just like the Irish accounts, the Scottish accounts showcase fairies as possessing both malevolent and non-malevolent tendencies. The Sealy Court in the aforementioned folk ballad are shown to be rescuers, most notably the fairy queen of that court, who not only saves the protagonist from the witch Alison Gross, but also recasts him into his original form. Yet it's interesting that, according to the Encyclopedia of Fairies, Hobgoblins, Brownies, Boogies, and other supernatural creatures, by author Catherine Mary Briggs, the Sealy Court could be morally ambivalent and even dangerous to humans at times, but evidently appeared to help humans who they had a personal liking for. In this sense, whether a fairy could be trusted or not was simply a coin toss, which in itself certainly makes an encounter with fairy folk somewhat concerning. The fairy queen in Tam Lim is much less ambiguous by contrast. Not only is she a kidnapper, but she forces Tam Lim to effectively rape the human women who pass through the forest, and proceeds to sacrifice her own kind to Satan. This is arguably one of, if not the worst fairy queens we've established in this episode, who's so brazenly diabolical that it reveals the magnitude of fairy cruelty and wickedness. In the most famous of Scottish tales, a 13th century ballad known as Thomas the Rhymer shows us that one day, a man named Thomas, a poet, was approached on the hills by a beautiful lady riding a white horse. This lady turned out to be a fairy queen of a realm known as Elfland, sometimes conflated with the mythological queen of Elfame, and that, just like the fairy queen in the Alison Gross narrative, seemed to take a liking to Thomas. Thomas fell under her spell and was whisked away into the fairy world, where he remained for 7 years. In some versions of this telling, the fairy queen serves as a guide for Thomas, almost akin to Dante's Virgil in the Divine Comedy, where Thomas is shown the fantastical fairy world and given a bit of a tour of this magical other realm. Yet in other versions, Thomas begins a love affair with the queen, where upon leaving the land, he is granted the ability to see the future, but also granted a boon that prevents him from ever telling a lie. The morality of this Queen of Elfland, or Queen of Elfame, is once again a complex thing to dissect. On the one hand, you might say that Thomas is abducted by the fairy queen, for even though he consents, he is then not allowed to leave her side for a full 7 years, making her seem cruel and coercive. Yet on the other hand, the fairy queen doesn't appear to corrupt him, but rather becomes his lover, and better yet, transforms him into a better man, who maintains his virtue by no longer being able to tell a lie and gains the ability of prophecy. In short, Thomas the Rhymer is left blessed and better for this encounter, even if the terms of engagement are a little dubious and somewhat predatory. The fairy queen then enforces her own laws with absolute authority, rewarding the endurance and obedience of Thomas while remaining indifferent to his possible human suffering as such. In this sense, she embodies the unsettling truth of what all fairies have come to showcase from the accounts we've discussed, that they all live in a zone between benevolence and wickedness, and could pick and choose from whatever side they fancied. Interestingly, this Queen of Elfame later emerged outside the pages of legend and found herself situated in an actual courtroom during the era of Scottish witchcraft trials. In the late 16th century, one Alison Pearson was accused of witchcraft and subsequently confessed that, much like Thomas the Rhymer, she too had been carried off to the land of Elfame, and on a number of occasions had met the queen and been in service to her. Supposedly, she explained that she had been put to work amongst the queen's elfin minions and made to pick herbs. The Queen of Elfame also found herself in another late 16th century witchcraft trial in the confession of accused witch Androman, who claimed that the devil had appeared in the likeness of the Queen of Elfame and that he had slept with this fairy queen on a number of occasions, even begetting children. In such accounts, it's likely that these confessions were extracted from the accused under duress, who obviously knew the stories of the fairy queen and found that the wondrous absurdity of such narratives would legitimize their confessions and put an end to their own torture. Nonetheless, this had the effect of further vilifying the fairy queen, and perhaps by association all other fairies, for not only were these now entities who could abduct and enslave whoever they wanted, but were also associates of the devil, who were actively working against Christianity by corrupting humans in all manner of different ways. So far we can see this idea of a fairy queen isn't necessarily specific to one particular character, but rather adopted by many different poets, authors and storytellers to illustrate an authoritative fairy presence, whether that be good or bad. Yet outside of the Irish and Scottish tales of Una, Cleena and the Queen of Elfame, there exists one other queen of fairies whose somewhat ominous name has stood the test of time, the reclusive entity known simply as Queen Mab. Now, literary geeks like me might probably recognise Queen Mab from Mercutio's soliloquy in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, but considering this was written sometime as late as the end of the 16th century, and considering the rich lore of fairy mythology, I naturally assume that Shakespeare had pinched this queen from one tale or another. The way Mercutio casually names her in his monologue made me think that this was an entity of common knowledge, and therefore must have had some roots in British mythology. Yet after some research, the waters do become muddy as to her exact origin, and there are those who consider Shakespeare to have simply been creative enough to have plucked her name from his own genius. However, we do know that it was not beyond him to use already existing characters. We see this exemplified in another fairy queen in Titania, in Midsummer Night's Dream, she who first appeared in the likes of Ovid's Metamorphosis. New Zealand historian and literary critic W.P. Reeves agreed with such a stance, saying, "One can hardly escape the feeling that he borrowed the idea and the name as he did that of Titania." In Act 1, Scene 4 of Romeo and Juliet, Mercutio speaks of Queen Mab and credits her with being the one who brings dreams and incites the deepest desires of one's own psyche. At its core, the inclusion of Queen Mab in Mercutio's soliloquy represents the restless and involuntary workings of the human imagination, especially at the surface from one's subconscious. While she might sound harmless at first, she is most certainly portrayed here as an intrusive force, who provokes desire, ambition, fear, and even violence. Indeed, she enables man to dream, but she also stimulates his existing impulses. Lovers therefore dream of love, appropriate to Romeo. Soldiers dream of war, and lawyers dream of money. In essence, Queen Mab agitates latent fixations. Unlike some of the ballads and legends we've looked at, Mercutio actually goes into quite some detail as to what Queen Mab looks like. She's no bigger than an agate stone, she fits on the forefinger of an alderman, and she rides around in an empty hazelnut, not to bring good tidings, but again to exasperate one's true intentions. With such a detailed description, you might say that Mercutio dispels much of the intrigue surrounding her, for he knows of her so well that he is able to portray her as grotesquely domestic, perhaps even insect-like, as he uses not the most flattering imagery to associate to her, that of a spider's web and that of grasshopper wings. This is quite the contrast to the fairy queen Titania in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, where Titania is spoken of with a language that is lush and deeply poetic, where she is associated with moonlight, flowers, dew, music, and seasonal harmony, giving her an aura of majesty and sensual beauty. Titania is also promoted to a more human level in Shakespeare's description, given that she's also human-sized, unlike Mab's diminutive stature, that again relegates her to something less human, and thus may have a more base or sinful purpose. Mercutio goes on to describe more of Queen Mab's exploits, telling us, "That is that very Mab that plaits the manes of horses in the night, and bakes the elf locks in foul sluttish hairs, which once untangled, much misfortune bodes." In this he references an old superstition that fairies, or demonic entities known as the mare demons, were believed to ride horses in the night to the point of exhaustion, which would result in the horse's mane becoming tangled. These creatures were also believed to ride upon trees too, in their nightly mischief, which was believed to explain why branches became entangled. Mercutio definitely speaks quite scathingly of Queen Mab, suggesting that as she too enjoys the same disorderly activities, she too is not such a far cry from the demonic. Furthermore, this isn't the only way that Mercutio connects Mab to the mare demons, for he tells us, "This is the hag when maids lie on their backs, that presses them and learns them first to bear, making them women of good carriage." In Germanic mythology, the mare demon, known there as Mara, would ride actual people in the middle of the night. In this tradition, the demon would seat itself atop the sleeping victim so as to cause discomfort and breathing difficulties. It was also known to pin their victim by either lying on the victim's stomach or chest in order to cause a crushing sensation. According to some experiences, those afflicted are unable to move or even call out for help, similar to sleep paralysis. Here they can only lie at the mercy of the mare and wait for her to leave, or hope that someone calls them by their baptismal name, which will break the spell and allow the victim to wake. Now once again, this sounds an awful lot like the Queen Mab that Mercutio describes in his monologue, and for readers who already had that knowledge of the mare demons, they might be all too quick to label her as malevolent, demonic, and an enemy to humankind. This imagery of having a creature like Mab, referred to as a hag by Mercutio, is also quite common amongst those who experience sleep paralysis, who see an old, withered hag of a woman proceed to mount their chest and make it difficult for them to breathe. The entire experience was captured most famously by Swiss painter Henry Fuseli in his The Nightmare, where we see a sleeping woman pounced upon by a demonic creature that sits atop her chest. Like their name suggests, the mare demons were believed to cause their sleeping victims to experience nightmares. In a way, this goes hand in hand with Mercutio's interpretation, where Queen Mab is described as something of a bringer of dreams, making the lover dream of love, the soldier dream of war, and the lawyer dream of money. Considering Mab is not spoken of in necessarily pleasant terms here, it's not such a stretch for us to imagine that Mab might also incite nightmares amongst her victims, inspiring the guilty to dream of their crimes, the adulterer to dream of their mistress, and the murderer to dream of their victim, etc. Whilst we are really unable to determine whether Shakespeare created Queen Mab, or if he borrowed her from existing folklore, one frequently cited theory links Mab to Maeve, the formidable queen of medieval Irish tradition. Despite the slight similarities in the name, in that they both begin with M, there is little meaningful resemblance between the two figures. Maeve is a towering warrior queen, a figure of sovereignty and violence, whereas Mab is imagined as something minute, fleeting and insubstantial, a fairy who operates not on the battlefield, but within the dreaming mind. Other proposals have been no less speculative. 19th century American journalist Wirt Sykes suggested that Mab derives from the Welsh Mab, meaning child or son, though critics have pointed out that this theory doesn't have much in the way of basis, and is again simply going on the similarity in the name. 19th century Irish writer Thomas Keatley, meanwhile, looked toward the medieval figure of Hambundia, or Dame Habundi, a nocturnal goddess associated with witches, and sometimes described as a queen, offering a darker and more folklorically coherent parallel. Perhaps the most convincing explanation, however, places Mab much closer to Shakespeare's own linguistic world. The name likely derives from Mabel, or the Middle English Mabili, used by Chaucer, both stemming from the Latin amabilis, meaning lovable. Significantly, Mab could also function as a nickname for a low-status woman, a prostitute, or even a hag-like witch. In this light, even the title Queen may be deliberately ironic. We see Mab used in another famous writer's work of Percy Bysshe Shelley, in his poem also titled Queen Mab, where Queen Mab descends upon a sleeping woman named Ianthe, and basically abducts her spirit from her sleeping body and transports it to her own magical palace at the edge of the universe. The poem is framed as a vision or dream, with Queen Mab serving as a celestial guide for Ianthe as she begins to teach her the true nature of human history, reveals the corruption that underlines society, and illustrates the ideal future utopia on the earth. In this narrative, Queen Mab does not appear to be a villain as such, for she comforts Ianthe with two of the poem's key points, that death isn't to be feared and the future can be perfect if humans work together. What's more, Queen Mab does not keep Ianthe prisoner in this fairy outer world, but returns her spirit to her body where she safely awakens on the earth. Through this, you might say Shelley sought to diminish the devilish nature that Mercutio portrayed Queen Mab as possessing, and in typical fairy tradition, created a character that was more autonomous, further implying that such creatures could commit both great evils and great goods. However, some might argue that Queen Mab in this poem is much less a character per se, and more of a mouthpiece for Shelley's own philosophy. In Ben Jonson's 1603 play, The Entertainment at Althorpe, Queen Mab is presented once again as the fairy queen, whose task it is to welcome the Queen Anne of Denmark, wife of James I, during a visit to London, and confer a sense of supernatural approval upon the royal visit. In this play, we see Mab, despite being addressed as the Queen of Fairies, pretty much slandered openly by a satire, who refers to her as the mistress fairy that doth nightly rob the dairy. He proceeds to further tarnish her name by revealing that she mistreats country wenches if they don't clean properly, steals babies in the middle of the night, and leads midwives to ponds to drown them. It's interesting that Johnson does not incorporate Shakespeare's ideas of Mab being a dreamcaster or an inducer of nightmares, but rather either creates his own version of Mab or is perhaps calling back to an even earlier version, perhaps the same source that Shakespeare had in mind. In any case, this Mab is much more dangerous than the Shakespearean Mab, for she is known here to commit murder, she actively kidnaps, and she has a reputation for being not at all very kind. Such characteristics go almost hand in hand with later renditions of Mab, such as the 1648 poem known as The Fairies by poet Robert Herrick. Here, Herrick presents Mab in a similar, albeit much less damning vein to Johnson, where she is seen to punish women who don't keep their houses clean. What emerges from this long and often contradictory tradition is that fairies resist moral simplification. Across Irish, Scottish, and various literary sources, they appear to be some of the most inconsistent characters in folklore. For where they are good and kind to one set of people, they are then wicked and rather inconsiderate to another. I suppose you might say that such an ambiguity helps explain why figures like Oregon of Alexandria were quick to categorize such beings as demonic. Faced with entities who could heal one moment and destroy the next, the safest theological position was to outright reject them and label them all as evil. Paracelsus, by contrast, sought to neutralize them and position them as part of God's created order. Yet folklore itself never fully committed to either of these Christian explanations. Why would it, when many of these legends likely predate Christianity anyway? Whether or not fairies are demons is really up to the believer to decide. Though considering the accounts we've gone through today, you might say that fairies are capable of the same virtues and transgressions that we are, even if their supernatural powers and ambiguous dispositions make them much more volatile and scary. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to leave this video a like and subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.